Lummi, Samish, and Samiamo people who have cared for and tended this land since time immemorial. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We begin this effort to acknowledge what has been buried by honoring the truth. We pay respect to their elders, past and present. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. And please join us in uncovering such truths at any and all public events. So welcome, everybody. We have, looks like a pretty full agenda today, so let's get going. We'll start with the update on the Justice Project. Since we talked last, we've done a lot of things. We had on November 15th, we had our town hall meeting. We had somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 testifying. I think it was 100 attendees. I counted like about 60 in chambers and about 40 out in Zoom land. And we had a lot of testimony, and it was very interesting. We had planned a 2-hour session, most of which was testimony from the public, an hour and a half of which was just pure testimony from the public. And we ran out of speakers exactly when we ran out of time. So I don't know how we did that, but it's just how it went down. So it was very efficient. Holly O'Neill did a great job of time management getting us through that. So we got a lot of input that will go along with the and actually will inform the final needs assessment because the public process is pretty broad. We had our SAC meeting. Oh, Michael, go ahead.
Just super fast, Barry. Thanks for that update. Was that recorded by any chance for those of us who weren't able to attend that? I would love to see that if that was, but I don't know if it was.
Sure, yes, I'm sure it is. I just don't know where to find it, but we'll get that out to you.
Super. All right, thanks.
Yeah.
Did anybody else watch that?
I did, and I continue to be impressed with the commitment of the leadership. Yes, so it was informative and helpful. Admittedly, I sat in my front room chair with my laptop on my lap, drinking coffee, and it was really very good input from my perspective.
Yeah, I thought it was just super input. I thought it was we did the 2-minute thing instead of 3, which worked well for that. We discussed that at our council meeting because they're trying to look at open comment. But I think when you have a specific topic like that, it really kept people on track, and they didn't seem to mind the 2 minutes. So for that application, it really seemed to work well. So we had 2 days later, we had our SAC number 6 meeting on the 17th. We kind of queued up for the release of the draft report, which has gone out now for review, and we're now receiving comments back. So Stephen, Jack, do you have any more to add, kind of what's gone on in the last month? I know we've been really busy, but
Well, we have another planning meeting this afternoon. We got back a draft of the community engagement feedback that the VITA agency gathered for us.
yeah.
Via social media, some one-to-one discussions with target group representatives, and then some focus groups with target group participants. All of that is a huge amount of information, some consistent, some not. And we haven't yet sat down and talked our way through that. So I've read through it, but haven't really digested it all. It's going to take a little while to try to get some coherent takeaways from that, I think. But I think that was extremely informative as well.
Yeah, you're right, Stephen. We've kind of turned on the fire hose coming our way for public input now. And so we're kind of in the receiving mode now and haven't done a full analysis, but we're getting a lot of comments. I think we had somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,500 responses, and I don't know what the update was. I didn't get an update on the survey that went out. So we had a lot of
I think that might have been something like 1,700, Barry.
1,700 we might have reached by the end of the closing. So that was successful as well. Our staff did a wonderful job of getting the word out, both for the survey and for the town hall. Our council staff, by the way, they went around Bellingham and out in the county and posted. So if you see a council staff member, please thank them for all their hard work, not only on this, but everything they do every day. So anyway, it's going well. We have another meeting next week. What we're calling meeting number 7 is kind of the collection of all the review comments we've gotten to date on the draft, and we'll be reconciling and talking about that on this next week. So that's it for that topic. Next one is me as well. I'm going to rely on Perry heavily for the competency restoration. So regarding competency restoration, we've been pretty busy as well. Perry brought me to a meeting that was at King County. The link is LINC.
It is. The link is correct. I'm sorry, I don't have the full acronym. Legal intervention. Sorry, I don't have the full name.
It's a diversion effort that's put forth by the prosecutor's office, right?
It is. It's a prosecutorial diversion process of where low-level charges of individuals can be diverted from the judicial involvement, and involved in, as you can imagine, the LINK program is housing resources surrounding case management, medication, those kinds of important dynamics that are social determinants of health, and then effectively providing the individual with the resources necessary to be stabilized and to continue. One of the advantages that they have with that is the funding and resources that they had for housing. They reiterated heavily that was a crucial component of the services that they had, as well as, of course, the other components, and that most of the folks that were involved in, Barry and I got to communicate with sort of the boots on the ground folks that are involved in providing the LINK program in King County. And they are, working very closely with that. I did find it interesting that they indicated that it was not followed at the level of a requirement process. Individuals did have voluntary opportunity to engage at the level that they were willing to at that point. And I was going to follow that up actually with just sort of, I don't know about their tracking, but efficacy in terms of keeping people engaged in the services and the programs, and et cetera. There's a little bit more just in terms of our most recent competency work group that I'll talk about, but maybe we'll stop and have Michael ask his question.
And I just wanted to add one thing before I was going to call on Michael, and that is that they have, one thing I was impressed with, that they have their own housing that they offer for supportive housing side of their work. So Michael.
So this is a great, and I'm super excited. As I was listening to you, Perry, I thought, wow, I could almost hear this as a LEAD program. So how would you, for those of us that are kind of familiar with LEAD, both because we blueprinted off Seattle when we made ours, right? How would you compare and contrast the differences in terms of like services, service intensity, diversion potential? Is it solely around competency? Maybe you could touch on that, because it sounded so similar in a really good way. And I'd like to hear more about those dedicated housing resources.
From my perception, Michael, I mean, it's a great point that it is similar to LEAD. Of course, the LEAD program does exist in King County, and so they work collectively in a collaborative way. This is oriented towards individuals that are struggling with serious mental illness and have a potential of being, involved in that process and getting stuck in that process of competency restoration. And it was the goal of King County, my understanding, to address this, this challenging issue with the state resources and processes and it being ineffective. And so, in comparison, I'd say that it is certainly larger than the LEAD program, and a huge component of the resources is the housing that is directly connected to the LINK program, and then thereby, of course, involving case managers and and individuals that can support that process because the individual is in a location where they can be supported consistently. And so that was a huge part of the discussion, as Barry had mentioned, was the housing component and the funds that they had available to them to purchase the housing. And we talked about that pretty extensively in our 11:30, our November 30 meeting, that certainly touched on LINK, but was actually from the Disability Rights Washington group, a set of attorneys that are working with the True Blood settlement. And I won't go on about that at this point, but there was, I think, a lot of help, maybe on a larger scale, obviously that would be available to Whatcom County, but nonetheless, just reiterating some of the information that we're aware of, that housing in particular is a key component to that.
And the one thing we wanted to bring up today is that we've gotten some offers for a presentation to the task force. And so we kind of wanted to put that before the group and see what everybody thought about that piece as well. So, Stephen?
Do you mean the LINK folks or DRW or who would present?
Wasn't the LINK folks the ones that volunteered, or was it Kim in their shop?
When you and I actually had an opportunity to meet with LINK folks that were, really the boots on the ground, providing the services and coordinating the services. And then later in our November 30th meeting at the Competency Restoration Group, the disability rights of folk, Kim Mosloff and Christopher Carney, were the attorneys that presented and talked about that larger picture of, what True Blood was about, the funds that 3 areas, King County, Pierce County, and Spokane areas had pursued funding in an initial sort of process and rollout of funding resources, and then implemented these programs, continuing to evaluate efficacy and those sorts of things, with hopefully, if my understanding is correct, future funds from the True Blood settlement being available more widely in the state. Almost, I don't know that it's a pilot project, obviously, but they wanted to do an initial rollout in some of the higher population locations in Washington to take a look at efficacy and that component. So
Perry, do you remember though which group wanted to come, that said that they would be happy to come and talk to us?
I thought that it was the Disability Rights Washington group.
Oh, could have been,
Yeah. And Chris, although I'm sure that the LINK folks, they were super helpful, very informative, obviously very proud of the work that they've done in this program. And I can't imagine that they wouldn't be, willing to describe their program and answer questions as well, if that's what
maybe we could shoot for trying to get both groups up and do, cover their areas. And I don't know, that might be a little long for a task force meeting, but.
Well, for what it's worth, I'd be interested in hearing from both groups.
I would.
The reason I raised my hand was twofold, really. Before that, one is so everybody probably noticed that the King County Prosecutor's Office, independently, perhaps with DRW, sued DSHS on its own for additional financial reimbursement for the costs of not carrying out True Blood. And I was wondering if some of that money they hope to channel into the LINK program. But my core question really is, anything like this sounds exciting to me, but frankly, I'm not sure exactly what the link is with what we've been calling competency restoration, it does sound more like lead, not somebody who's committed a crime, is in the system, and it's not even clear that they understand the charge or could help their attorney, which is where the competency evaluation and restoration problem arises. This doesn't sound like it's dealing with people that severely impaired, or if it is, I'm not seeing what that link is.
You know, one of the things that I can say to that, Stephen, is I think that you are accurate that this is more generally a process, a diversion process of identifying individuals with certain charges that the prosecutor's office is willing to, you know, table or disregard completely if the individual is willing to go into the LINK program and receive those resources and so forth. I don't know that it's directed specifically towards individuals that certainly it could be at risk in terms of competency restoration, because it sounded like from their description, the level of mental illness can vary greatly, and they definitely talked about psychiatric services, availability to prescriber, those kinds of things, which would certainly suggest serious mental illness, and the risk of you know, competency being a challenge in terms of understanding the charge and you know, the process there. And again, the part that I wanted to understand a little bit more about when they were actually, you know, literally describing the components of the LINK program was that it was not a requirement, it was a dismissal of charges. And so I was curious, just as an old provider, I couldn't help it, but understanding how do you keep folks that are, you know, engaged in the LINK program? You know, what are the sort of, you know, methodologies of that? Because, you know, that efficacy, and oftentimes individuals that are struggling with this level of mental illness may not necessarily view themselves as having a mental illness, or the necessity for medication, you know, the side effects of that, and those kinds of pieces. And so understanding just a little bit more, but my sense of it was that because of the fact that housing was available, it made individuals proximity available to continue to bring them services, very heavy case management availability, you know, continuing to work with the individuals in regards to sort of helping them progress and get established, was really the draw to remain engaged in the LINK program. And it was for extensive periods of time in the housing components and that sort of piece. I actually pulled up my notes just from our competency restoration work group on the 30th of November. And of course, this was more the disability rights folks, as opposed to, they were making reference to LINK, but they were talking about that higher picture, that larger picture. And we didn't get back into the details of that.
And I think too, Stephen, it was just something through the research, you know, the work group is really in heavy research mode too, as well right now. And this is just something we kind of came across that we thought was important. And might be a huge interest to the task force because of its potential implications.
And I'll just note that competency restoration is one of the points on the legislative priorities that I hope we're going to have time to talk about later in the agenda.
Yeah. Okay, Raylene.
Thank you. You know, I think it's always great to look at different avenues. I'm going to be a little bit of a negative Nelly, so my apologies. But, you know, Maya brought up into cases that I think there was a new legislative action that allowed the diversion programs for people that needed to get mental health instead of being convicted of a crime. So there was a diversion program, but there wasn't a psychiatrist, there wasn't a psychologist available to do these evaluations in order to make some of these programs work. And we've got PCN that just closed. And so I'm seeing more and more restoration needs. So we've got this program that might be really awesome that we would want to look at. But if we can't get staffing and we've got places closing down, looking at a new program might be something we need to put on the back burner until we can actually adequately staff for restoration. services. I talked to some of the officers today. We are actually doing oral boards here for Blaine Police. They're doing it in the room. So I've got representatives from different departments that I actually spoke with this morning, and it was depressing. It was really, really depressing to hear some of the things. And most of these representatives are from small cities. I'm not going to name names, but they were, you know, we don't know if we should even bother calling MCOT out for some of our behavioral health needs, because they really don't leave the Bellingham area. We're small cities. They have way more need than what the small cities have. So when we call them, we know that it's maybe a 10% chance that they'll be available to come and help us with our people. We're not charging a lot of our mental health people with crimes anymore. We don't bother because the cases are going to be dismissed anyways. So unless it's a serious felony and we know we can actually arrest them, we're not doing that. We can sometimes get them as an involuntary hold at the hospital, but they're really not staffed, or they can't adequately assist us with our needs. They had one guy in the last week that they've contacted at least 10 times. So we've got all these wonderful resources. We're working on trying to make things better. And what I'm hearing from law enforcement in the small cities is we don't have a place to stick them. When they do get arrested, some of their cases are being dismissed because they are found incompetent, but their restoration services aren't available. The jail is full of individuals that need restoration, but that's not available. So then I did a little more digging, and sorry if I'm going into the weeds, but I did some research this morning and learned how to run a query in the long arm system for Blaine on behavioral health. And I think Caleb might be interested in getting Allie from Bellingham on board to help with some of these queries and on the index committee. So I know that's kind of a side thing, but when I ran the query with a little box that says behavioral health checked, that says yes, for 1 year, I only got 10 people. And I was like, what, why is this? Well, because the officers aren't checking the box, basically. They don't realize that you can actually run this report to see how many behavioral health people are in Blaine that needed help. Then I ran a query where you put just the offense code of behavioral health and don't have a little box checked, and I got 37, which was higher. When I checked with Bellingham, who's been using the long arm a lot longer, they had 2,300. So yes, there is definitely more of a need when you have a bigger population in that area. But I think there's some training on getting this data so that we can see how much some of the other small cities use them. And when law enforcement officers that are out on the road are giving up, they aren't using the new triage center because they know that the people can walk away from that. They're only using the hospital, and they're only using that for the involuntary, very serious holds. And then when the hospital staff are saying, well, we're going to have this person charged because they just assaulted the nurse. And then you have PCN closing. And now we're looking at this new program, which might be wonderful, but we can't even get the existing programs used properly. I have concerns. Sorry.
Arlene?
Yeah, I don't see what you're saying, Raylene, as negative. I see it as a piece or a gap in our system that we have to hammer on as we're asking for these various changes like alternate response team and law enforcement. We need them. They're very important, but they understand that the gap in treatment is appalling. And all the gathering up of people in crisis needs the place for them to go. I've been hammering it on you guys. You've been listening to me for a long time. Thank you. And but that means every time that we ask for funding for a new program, we have to be sure that we equally lean on the providing of treatment sources. And even the issue of St. Joe's Hospital has been on my mind lately. They have had in the past hospitalization beds and programs, and I'm not sure exactly what they're doing, but every report I get from counselors is that it's not available. It's not available. There aren't treaters that come in to deal with mental health cases immediately the way there is for specialty medical problems. So some negotiations perhaps should go on with the administration of the hospital, because they have rooms, they have beds, but they need programs filled out with staff. And I mean, so that's my main point, is let's not drop the ball as we ask for things and as we establish things, and remember that there's this gap there that we have to keep working on. I don't think it's hopeless. I really don't. I just think that we have to remember to hold them together. Just like when, as we're advocating for prescribers for the jail, we need treaters to go into the jail with those prescribers or around the same time, because if they get medicine and no treatment, it isn't sufficient.
Stephen.
Thanks, Barry. I'm going to observe that I think we've taken in the steering committee what was a report on a meeting, and we've turned it into a substantive discussion that I don't think is ours to have. I guess what I'd like to do is to ask Mike if he'd be willing to take some of the observations that Raylene and Arlene and Perry have shared into the agenda pretty soon of the Behavioral Health Committee, or perhaps in the joint Legal and Justice Systems Behavioral Health Committee meeting, because I think that's where some of these threads need to be pulled out. I mean, what I'm hearing is much the same as what we faced in 2017, where police they were just taking people to the emergency room. They weren't being handled, and people weren't being charged. I don't know why people who aren't being charged aren't taken to the crisis stabilization center, but that's a question that there must be an answer to. I'm distressed that police can't fill out the forms. But I think all of these are pieces of the puzzle. It's like all of us standing around the elephant, having a little piece of the puzzle, and someplace substantively we ought to try to dissect this and put our finger on some places where we could make some recommendations. But I don't think that's the steering committee.
Well, just to close this item out, would you like us to try to get those folks up here, say sometime during the first quarter of next year, or do you want us to hold off?
Jack, you have any thoughts on this?
Well, I agree. The fuller discussion. I was smiling at your comments, Stephen, because I agree that it's an important topic. We're kind of off agenda. I don't think we're going to solve. I mean, no, I don't. I don't have the answers to this. I agree with everything I've heard, but I don't really think it's where we are right now on this. Meaning this, because I mean, basically, unless I'm mistaken on my agenda, are we on competency restoration or project and stakeholder? Exactly, competency. And I think it's a fuller discussion. So, and it almost ties into what is the role of the steering committee. And I'm a little discouraged. I know Raylene is right, because I've heard it too. So I'm going to throw in and go off topic that law enforcement isn't dropping off, because our whole goal is that they would. And so the one takeaway for me is trying to do what we can to liaison to law enforcement to try to figure out what can we do to encourage it. Because the whole goal of that center in the context of incarceration reduction was to make it a viable alternative. And if people on the street, if the officers in the field aren't comfortable with that, we've missed the mark. And I don't know, Caleb, you may have thoughts on that too, because you hear stuff, but maybe we could do a better job of reaching out. Maybe we can liaison, maybe Perry can help let them know how people are encouraged to say, even though they aren't forced to say. But that was the one thing that kept going through my mind on this. Thanks.
So what I'm hearing is maybe the answer is no, we shouldn't schedule anything. I think maybe I will look at scheduling or look at the potential of scheduling it in my committee and the council. So Perry, you and I can work together on that. Let's go ahead and move on to the next item. I think we've burned enough time on that. 2022 year-end report, Jill.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I emailed you all the updated version of the report on Tuesday. And again, just now, Jackie and I went through and did some proofing and updating of the report. Since then, Perry suggested some changes for his committee section. And those changes are reflected, I believe, in the version that I just, no, they're not. They're not. So I have some changes from Perry. Do you feel the need for me to go through this again, page by page, like we did before, or shall I just start with a couple of notes that I have? What do you guys need from me?
What's the will of the committee?
Just the notes.
Just the notes. I would agree.
Great.
Just the high level.
Thank you. So the only questions that I have left are, one is more of a note. After next Tuesday's joint meeting, I will add a section for the joint committees about the presentation on the 988 crisis line service. So there will be a paragraph there that I will add that is not included right now. And other than that, the only question that remains is what attachments you would like to include in the report. We've already agreed that the SIM will be included in all task force reports to the council. So that's one attachment. It was mentioned earlier, possibly including an attachment of the presentation that Caleb gave to the SAC about data. I have that pulled up and can screen share if you'd like, so you can see what I'm talking about. It's quite lengthy. Caleb, yeah, you want to see that? Okay. Let me pull this up right quick. Okay, you see this presentation here? I think it was you, Stephen, who asked that this be included. Is that something that you all still want to include in as an attachment to the year-end report? This was the presentation, I believe, that was given to the SAC.
It was my request, but I am glad to defer. I see Jack's hand up, and I appreciate Caleb's thoughts on that also.
Jack?
My hand was up actually on a different comment,
Okay.
so I'll raise it again later. I want to
Okay.
comment on Perry's on the actual edits and changes.
Okay.
But I mean, how long is how many pages is the report, Jill?
The report is 14 pages. This attachment is 26 pages. The SIM is another, I want to say 4 to 6 pages.
So the one concern I have, I agree it's valuable to give it, but I can't imagine, Barry, you have more input on this than anyone else, but when you get 500 and 600 page council books, I don't know how much of it gets looked at all the time. So part of me thinks shorter reports are more likely to get attention. But I can see the value if somebody wants to look at it. I can see why Stephen wants it there.
And an alternative is, instead of adding it as an attachment, I can just put a link to it in the document itself and post it on the website. That might be more reasonable. Yeah, I'm seeing head nods. Great. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Caleb. The other requested attachment is, let's see what I've got here on my notes. The wish list, the draft wish list, Stephen, is that something that you'd like to include as an attachment?
An attachment to the annual report?
Yes.
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
And I see Mike's in agreement with that also.
Okay, perfect. And the last that I have is, and most of you haven't seen this yet, this is the draft communications plan from Pyramid. So we do talk about the communications work in the year-end report, and we just now have this draft plan that we're working on with the core team about what's going to be happening in the coming weeks and months with Pyramid Public Relations to the community. So this is some information we can add as an attachment as well.
Is that
This is-
everything, Jill, that you have on the report?
Yes.
Okay, any other questions on that? Jack, is your hand for that other issue?
Yeah, I had a question on Perry's. First of all, I like your edits, Perry, but my question, I'm going to get into the weeds a little bit, was on the 12-hour. It's not ironic, so we're going back to the 12-hour hold. So you quote the WAC, you talk about the 12-hour hold, but there's a line here that says that you can require him to stay, but then it says if an individual placed on a hold leaves before the 12 hours are completed. So my question is, which is it? Is it a 12-hour hold they can't leave that's involuntary, or is it a 12-hour hold that they can choose to leave?
And I super appreciate the question, Jack. The answer to the question is that it is not a locked facility, and an individual can leave regardless of status. And that's the short answer to the question.
Then it really isn't an involuntary hold, and that wasn't really what we were told was happening in that facility.
Well, within the WAC, it is an involuntary hold just by virtue of the fact that the individual, and so I can just describe it this way, law
Sure.
enforcement takes them, there's a discussion with the individual that they understand that they are required, there is a law enforcement hold that's been placed on them, they are required to remain in the facility for a minimum of a 12-hour period of time. I make reference to the fact that we hope for longer because stabilization requires longer, but the certification that has been received, and of course the previous certification that was for the facility, does not allow it to be, it's a residential treatment facility. It does not allow it to be locked, and it does not allow the process of containment of an individual, of going hands-on for an individual, that sort of piece. So it is an agreement between law enforcement. I mean, the way that I see it, law enforcement says, Perry, you have a choice. You can go to jail. You can go to the Crisis Stabilization Center. Food's great, private room. They'll help you. They'll work with you. If you leave before a 12-hour period of time, you may in fact then be arrested. That's the choice of the law enforcement, if that is going to occur. And so what we're talking about in terms of, and people oftentimes talk about this, is why isn't it involuntary? Well, we have those. They're called evaluation and treatment centers, and there's a couple of them within the North Sound region that individuals can be taken to, and an involuntary, it has to be a involuntary treatment admission process where I think folks are familiar. A designated crisis responder completes an ITA evaluation. There's a process of an initial hold, and then that can be extended and remain longer. But for an involuntary process within the state of Washington at any facility that's licensed to do so, there is an extensive process that has to take place by virtue of the fact that, of course, we're removing an individual's constitutional rights. What the 12-hour hold does, in my opinion, is says, let's bring you to a facility. Let's make an agreement that you will remain at the facility. And if you leave the facility, the law enforcement officer, of course, they may not be on shift at that point, but the law enforcement office is informed, yep, this individual that you admitted on the 12-hour hold is not, did not remain, and they left, and then it's basically turned back to a decision of a criminal process. If that just clarifies the.
Well, it does and it doesn't, because Ann told me there would be restraints. Are there no restraints?
There are no restraints. There is a seclusion room in both sides of the crisis stabilization center.
What does that mean? Is that like a padded room you can lock from the outside?
It is, and that it allows observation, that kind of possibility. And my recollection of that discussion and so forth at that point was, yes, it's not being licensed as a ENT for involuntary admissions, but we may want to build it and design it in such a way that if that were necessary, that the physical building does have the capability of
Well, that's exactly what I remember. And so I guess where I'm confused is we had a lot of discussion about this because initially the task force wasn't necessarily on board with the idea of a restraint facility. We then agreed to have one as a task force as a whole. But what I'm hearing we're having now is not really the ENT function where it's a true restraint or a true involuntary hold. It's something that's legally called an involuntary hold that's voluntary.
That's
And
correct.
there's no escape, or in other words, there's no criminal consequence if somebody walks away. You could be arrested, but it's not like being in work release and walking away, right? I mean, there's not like you
That's
don't get
correct.
charged necessarily. So it kind of takes the teeth out of the whole thing, and it's very inconsistent with what my understanding of what we were doing was and what we approved.
Understood.
Okay, thanks.
Raylene,
I agree with Jack on that because I was under the impression that half the center was for involuntary and the other half was going to be for voluntary. And that they were working towards that for law enforcement. And then I'm like, okay, but they can still walk away. And if law enforcement has an issue with somebody and they know that there is a possibility of walking away, and you've got somebody in a small city out here and you've got maybe 2 officers on, maybe you've got 1 officer on, and you've got somebody that's been a problem you've made 3 or 4 trips to the same location. You finally decide, okay, we need to do an involuntary hold on this person. We can drop them off at the facility, but there's a high likelihood we're going to be dealing with this person again. So we're just going to bring them to the hospital instead, because at least we know they can't walk away, or we're just going to book them. But if we can only put them in jail if there's space in the jail, which isn't there. So then they're just like, so what do we do? I mean, it's got to be pretty serious for them to take that initiative to bring that person in, and we want to use this center. So I think we got to look at how do we really want to use the center, and what licenses do we want to make changes, because there's not enough space at the hospital either to do adequate services.
Right. Yeah. Yep.
I wanted to ask, where are those facilities that have secure security areas? What cities?
The evaluation and treatment center, the closest evaluation and treatment center is Everett and Mukilteo.
Oh, okay.
Arlene, I've toured the one in Yakima. It's pretty interesting and it's nice. It's the ENT there.
Right. And so if I can, a couple of the pieces that I want to throw into this, not meaning to jump in front of anybody here with hands up, but a couple of the components are to also understand is any individual that's brought in on a 12-hour hold, and this is actually true for individuals that are brought to the Crisis Stabilization Center regardless, or admitted to the Crisis Stabilization Center. As a staff, if the staff observes that the individual is a harm to a risk to themselves or others, there is they will call a DCR in to do an evaluation and go through that process of potential involuntary treatment admission. That is actually required as a part of the process if the individual is demonstrating those kinds of behaviors and so forth with the staff, certainly for individuals that are on a 12-hour law enforcement hold. So it is potential that that individual could actually be evaluated for ITA and actually placed, which is at this point in time at the hospital. They cannot hold an individual on ITA at the Crisis Stabilization Center with the current certification that they have. The other thing that I'll put out there is part of the challenge is the cost of providing services for an involuntary facility are significant. You must have a physician on staff for for each of the shifts, and a number of other components that come into play in regard to that cost. And that was part of the determining factor eventually about the certification that would be sought after from the state for the Crisis Stabilization Center. So wanted to provide those 2 pieces of information while we're having this discussion. Thanks.
Stephen.
Yeah, Perry, I understand what you're saying, but I'm with Jack and Raylene here. My distress is over how much time and discussion was put into this 12-hour involuntary hold, which I think was a priority and a very strong recommendation from law enforcement, include maybe primarily the sheriff. And I know there's ITA options there. We also knew that, you know, somebody who was cooperative but in acute distress would be an ordinary admit. But I thought we were dealing with that gap in between where somebody needed more than the short, indeterminate acute stabilization time, but not so severe as an ITA 72-hour hold. And I've never heard before that it was a negotiation and you know, sort of a compact. An involuntary hold that law enforcement placed is determined by law enforcement, it seemed to me. And that doesn't seem to be the case. So we've got, like Jack said, we've got something that's very different than I think anybody on the task force would have expected from the deliberations we went through and all the effort you put into getting that certification.
And if I can quickly, that I do want to clarify that just in the description of when Jack and I were, you know, trading the information, that it is not a negotiation. If a 12-hour hold is placed on an individual, that is a legal process that has taken place. Whether, you know, the question, and I don't know the answer to this, that it's like, well, okay, what if the individual doesn't follow that? You know, what if the individual in fact leaves, like a work release setting or whatever, that's going to be the determination of, in my understanding, the prosecutor's office and law enforcement of what would happen next. Would that individual in fact would a warrant be issued for that individual's arrest? And you know, that again, not knowing legal processes, that certainly could be a consequence of leaving the facility. And so I would say that in my description, I may have misdirected in terms of saying that it is a negotiation. The individual is informed of their status. They're told that if they do leave, that information will be reported, and that you know, the staff are responsible to report that information. Past a 12-hour period of time, it's always that individual's then, you know, right to be able to decide that they're going to leave the facility, and et cetera. And this is common of where I've honestly, you know, worked quite a bit with law enforcement and said, well, we thought that the Crisis Stabilization Center was a locked facility, was in fact an ENT. And, you know, why don't we have that was the question. And the larger answer to that is there are evaluation and treatment centers with involuntary treatment admission in the region. And those are regional facilities, not, you know, local community facilities, that those admissions can occur. That depends on, of course, evaluation and determination of designated crisis responders to say that the person meets the criteria. So appreciate your statement. Just wanted to make a clarification in terms of our earlier discussion.
Jill?
Jack and Perry, do you want to rewrite some of what Perry has written here for the report to reflect the conversation and the more accurate use of the center?
Either that, or I might leave some of it out. I know the report soon, and I'm not trying to wordsmith it. Perry, I know you hear the concern, but I think if this goes out as is, it may raise some questions. And so I think it would be appropriate to actually remove some of what might happen with the 12-hour for now until we have clarity from the prosecutor's office and other things. I think that would be the approach I would take, because it sounds like we're still in the process of formulating what would actually happen.
Is it? I don't know if it's appropriate, and so forgive me if not. I'm more than willing to communicate with you, Jack, just in terms of I've got that up, could send just that in an email with edit suggestions.
Yeah,
If
why don't
that's
you guys do that? Yeah, that's a great idea.
Yeah,
If you're
Perry,
open
can you
to
send
that.
that to Jack and me after the meeting? That would be great. I'll incorporate it into the year-end report, Jack, and you can let me know if it meets your needs.
Or I can approach it directly. Jack, what's your thought?
I mean, I'm happy to look at it. I totally trust you. I know you hear the concern. I just think this may be a little proscriptive for where we are, not quite being sure.
Okay, and how about if I make, you know, from this discussion, how about if I make that a suggestion and just bounce it off of you as a
Sure,
email?
I'm happy to do that. And
then I'll carry it to Jill from there.
we're all on the same page. I'm trying to avoid concern and other things, I think we can come up with something that'll be just fine.
And it's a great point. Clarity is super important, obviously. And that was my attempt to, within this committee, it's like, wait, Perry, clarify that a little bit. If that clarification isn't here, it most certainly is not going to be out in the community. So I appreciate the feedback.
And if we can get resolution to that by the end of the day today, so I can get the packet out for the full task force for their meeting tomorrow, that would be great.
Sure. If you send me something, Perry, I will look at it this afternoon. I'm in these meetings all afternoon, so no problem.
I will absolutely do it.
All right. Thanks.
And
Caleb,
then in
did you-
terms of the
Caleb,
overall,
did you have-
His
yes,
hand was
Sorry,
up.
Joe.
that's all that I have for the report. My only remaining question is, do you want to, as a committee, take a vote to move this forward to the task force, or just leave it as is and let me make my changes and then have the full task force vote on it at its next meeting? Either way is fine with me, and either
Either
way.
way is fine with me. I think maybe it might, what do you guys think? Would we just weigh in by email then, Jill? Or do you want us to vote right now?
Weighing in by email is not an option.
Yeah, that's true.
So I can take your feedback today and then just make the changes and put it forward to the full task force at that time.
That's what I would do, Jill. I
Okay.
don't think we need a vote in the steering committee.
Perfect. That's
Yeah.
all that I have then. Thank you.
Caleb, you had your hand up.
Can't unmute myself, sorry. Yeah, I'm not sure my comments were necessarily constructive, so I'll hold back. I don't want to pile on. I just had some, sort of framework discussion for corrections and how it interfaces with the stabilization center, but it's probably not important.
I, for one, would like to hear him.
I would too.
Well, I mean, my concern is that anecdotally speaking, broad brushstrokes, nothing specific, that if law enforcement encounters somebody who truly needs some form of treatment, and there are really two options, they say you can go to full incarceration at the jail, or you can go to the crisis stabilization center and have a 12-hour hold. And that, I mean, I understand we're not talking about it in terms of negotiation, but that is really what's taking place is, look, you can have this or you can have this. The major crux of the issue is twofold. Number one, if they have any assaultive tendencies at all, they're not appropriate for crisis stabilization because it is not a secure correctional facility. It's not even going to be an option. So if they have assaultive tendencies even slightly, they're going to have to go the jail option. If though their offense, whatever they're recording in the offense category, doesn't necessarily meet with booking restrictions, they're not going to go to jail either way. So you've got to sort of have this half promise that, hey, you can either not go to jail or you can go to this 12-hour hold. And it doesn't really have any follow through. And so let's say, for example, somebody has broken a bunch of their own stuff. It's not a felony. It's not a domestic violence, but they've represented some risk. And that's the only thing that law enforcement can use in terms of a crime, malicious mischief. It's a misdemeanor, gross misdemeanor, what have you. Well, it doesn't meet our booking restrictions, but they have the option of saying, hey, let's take you to the crisis stabilization center. We can check you in. You can get help that you need. If you don't choose that option, then we have to take you to jail. Well, they're not going to go to jail either way. And so that doesn't have any, doesn't have any real teeth, as we pointed out earlier. And let's say, for example, it would normally be something that they would go to jail for. They're not ever going to go to the crisis stabilization center. So if it's a mandatory arrest situation, say it's domestic violence or some crime where it truly needs to be dealt with in a judicial fashion, they're not going to go to the crisis stabilization center. So I think we find, and I don't know what the real feel is, Perry, but I think we find a very, very small portion of arrest encounters that actually would be appropriate for crisis stabilization. And that's unfortunate. I don't like the situation that we're in there, but I don't see many of the encounters that law enforcement have where they're going, my first option is to go crisis stabilization. because it just fits like a well-worn boot. It just doesn't exist. If the nature of the facility were such that, look, you don't have another option. You've got too many encounters with police today. I've got to take you into custody. You have to go somewhere, and the best place for you is crisis stabilization. That would be beautiful, but I don't think that that is the first stop for any law enforcement officer. And so we have kind of this moment where people are malingering in our community, needing services, but not able to get them. And we also have people who are in our community who have, you know, potentially in real way seriously violated the safety of our community and need to be put in jail. And so I'm just struggling with the real application of this facility. And I don't know, maybe I'm completely off base, but I'm having a hard time imagining any scenario, well, very few scenarios more where we're gonna have with people in this fairly narrow guidelines. And the other thing that I'd say is, say somebody violated a 12-hour hold, but they're not going to do anything. I really don't think they're going to do anything. Law enforcement is going to go, well, yeah, too bad. You had the opportunity to get some services and you chose not to get them. Because there isn't a back door. That doesn't just automatically mean that you're going to get access to the jail facility. We don't have the space for that. If we did have the space, maybe we would be able to say, you know what, this truly is an option, either or. Right now, it's just triage or bust. I mean, I can think of an example really relatively recently, like within the last couple of years, somebody was in crisis and they were smashing windows at the Crisis Stabilization Center. They were hitting, some of the cameras and other security equipment. It was a real problem, right? I mean, this is not nothing. People's, property for certain, governmental property was at risk, and maybe people. I don't know. The guy might have been assaulted at some point. He didn't get arrested. The police came, they talked to him, they de-escalated the situation, and then they left. And he literally didn't even leave the property. That's indicative of the kind of thing that it requires a fairly large bar to get over in order to go either to jail or to actually be admitted to the stabilization center. And again, I'm not sure all of this is super salient to the conversation. I just have concerns, right? Kind of like everybody else has said, but I have concerns that we're really working with a very small slice of the pie here.
And if I can, I really appreciate that, Caleb, certainly that perspective. And one of the things that I can share is, and obviously we've talked about this before, that there is data that is tracked in terms of referrals, drop-offs at the Crisis Stabilization Center. And what we're seeing at this point in time is actually law enforcement, not limited to the sheriff's office, but law enforcement are transporting individuals to the Crisis Stabilization Center. And we also, within this year, and maybe folks had seen this, but implemented a streamlined process for law enforcement. They can pick up the phone and say, I've got Perry Mowry, and do you have a bed available? They ask 5 questions and say, bring him. And that's that streamlined process in recognition that we don't want law enforcement, encumbered in some process. So they need to be out on patrol. And so that needs to be very, very quick. So we've actually been able to implement that. And what we've seen is actually an increase as far as the bed utilization, as well as law enforcement using the Crisis Stabilization Center. Now, again, this is not 12-hour hold. And I'm probably overly optimistic, but I am curious, honestly, to see the results of our 12-hour holds. That the assumption is the person's just going to leave. I mean, for many, I'm not saying for you, but for many, the individual is going to leave. And it's like, well, if it's cold outside and they have a snack and a private room, maybe the individual will make that decision. I understand, of course, that we're talking about, yes, but it's not compulsory. It's not a requirement of that individual. And I suppose that, possibly a further discussion and communication that I need to take is communication with the prosecutor's office and saying, is there an additional option of consequence, teeth to the tiger, if you will, instead of simply, no, nothing's going to happen for this individual. Is that something that, can be discussed and created there? Again, we're getting to the legal piece of it and law enforcement piece, and I, of course, don't know. But I really appreciate the the conversation and the concerns, because I think they're real.
All right, folks, that was definitely a rich discussion on a year-end report. So let's go ahead and move on to composition and role of the steering committee. I don't know where this came from. Is this yours, Stephen?
No, it's not. I don't know where it came from either. I know Jack has raised some questions here in the past, but I raised my hand, Barry, to.
I think it was Mike. I think Mike brought it up. is my
Okay.
memory.
Oh, okay. And I'll defer to Mike, but I raised my hand to ask the question whether or not we might bump the legislative priorities discussion up to this point, given that we've taken so much time on the other subjects so far. And there's some time sensitivity to that.
That's fine with me. I think that's a good idea.
Well, Mike was sort of the facilitator of that conversation, and I would leave it as his call.
It's actually not even on the agenda, but
No, it came from Jill after the packet went out as an other business item.
oh, okay. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and move into that. Mike, is that what your hand is up for, or?
Sure, we're going to talk about composition because I can be very brief about that. Okay, I'm getting the nod from Stephen. So observation I had was, Caleb, you weren't here, but Chief Tank was here, and just realizing the importance of law enforcement in steering. The other observation, and looking a little bit at the composition, Jack and Stephen did a really nice job kind of, outlining where steering even came from, really, right? And it's agenda setting. It's not necessarily deciding. That's the job of the whole task force. My point is that who sets the agenda to some degree has some power in it too. And there's been so much, so I have two specific recommendations. One might be citizens representative or somebody who's been criminal justice involved, could be very useful as a slated seat in steering, whether that be a steering committee, an IPRTF member already, or whether we recruit. And the other thing is just recognizing the value of law enforcement's role. And, Caleb, when I hear you talk, it's sometimes it's the missing spot in it, or missing perspective sometimes, I feel, in the task force. So value your time and know that most of our law enforcement folks are out in the field doing what they need to be doing. So I guess what I wanted to bring up is that those who set the agendas to some degree have a little bit of power. And although we have talked largely about steering as really not where the decisions are being made, I would like to beg to differ just slightly with that and make recommendations that the steering committee in 2023 look at its composition and take some of our messages from the community about transparency, about representation. And I have two very different thoughts. And one is enshrining and really honoring the role of law enforcement and how important the perspective is for collaboration, for mutual working on things together, and how crucial that is. And then kind of, it's not really opposite, but a very different take would be community representation. So those were my 2 points regarding that. And also from that diversity, equity, and inclusion standpoint, right? Just looking at our composition in the room, we're not always the most diverse. What can we do to increase diversity? And is there a value for actually looking at the composition of our steering committee? So those are the things that I bring forward. I know we don't have time to go into that in a ton of detail. And I wonder if steering would be willing at looking at this as a 2023 future topic of conversation to see how we might delve in. Thanks for the time.
I like your idea, Mike. And I just wanted to ask a question of Jill. Where is that composition defined? Is it in anything that is it just a loose something, or is it something in our actual charter of the group?
It's not in the charter of the group. I believe all the committees were formed back when Waha was the facilitator. I would have to go back and look and see if there was a motion. I don't know if there was or not. And if there was a motion, was there an intent for or a purpose assigned to each one of those committees? So I would have to do some research, which I'm happy to do. I just can't answer that right now.
Okay, Jack?
I don't think there was a formal motion that I recall. We just, because it was Ken and Jill Bernstein and I were the initial steering committee. And then we thought it made sense to bring in the subcommittee chairs and other people that wanted to attend. And the reason, Jill, I think there may not be anything real formal, you may recall for a long time too, we really didn't take any votes or any motions. We were a non-deliberative body. So that would be my recollection of how that went.
So then it sounds like to make any kind of adjustments would be something internal to this group to be able to facilitate our own committee. Is that a fair assessment, Jack? Stephen?
I happen to like Mike's suggestion as well. And I would just ask Jill if she could put this on the January steering committee agenda. You know, we can defer it if we have other things that have priority, but I don't see any reason to delay starting the conversation that Mike has framed pretty nicely.
Yeah, we can go ahead and schedule it for January.
All right, thank you, Mike. That's a great suggestion. So Stephen, let's go ahead and talk about legislative priorities.
Well, I'm going to kick this off, and then if you want, Mike, I'll turn it over to you. I can't remember if it was a behavioral health subcommittee or a joint meeting with behavioral health and legal and justice
It was joint.
systems. Yeah, there were presentations by Joe Valentine of the North Sound ASO and Representative Alicia Rule. In the course of that, much to our astonishment, Representative Rule said, well, give me a list of priorities of things that you want me to work on in the legislative session. And so we thought that was incredibly generous, and we hadn't been in that position before. So we formed very quickly a small work group out of the attendees. Mike was the facilitator of that. We came down to 3 or 4 priorities and a background list that was much longer. And so that's been distributed in a draft form. I would say that none of them has absolute unanimity, even in that small 6-person group, but they all have strong majority support. And we wanted to run them past the steering committee and the joint meeting next week, and maybe ultimately the task force. We do have a meeting, a very brief meeting with Representative Rule set up for a week from tomorrow, and one that's, I think, still pinning down a time with Senator-elect Shoemake, who's also expressed interest in championing our things. And as you've all been reading about, a lot of these topics are being voiced strongly across the state, and so certainly will be taken up in the legislature, but we wanted to articulate, since we're a little bit ahead of a lot of places, we wanted to articulate for our own legislative contingent what and why we wanted their attention to be focused on. And so you have before you a draft of that. Mike, let me open this up for you to flesh it out a little bit.
There's Stephen, that was such a good coverage of it. I'm not sure there's a ton to add. I did want to, I think one of the things is advocacy is reasonably, at least in my brief time with you all, is kind of newish to the task force. And so wanting to make sure that it kind of embodied things. So I would just mention a couple of things. One, it was the think tank of people from our combined legal and justice behavioral health subcommittees and some of the issues that we looked at. 2, we looked at, Jackie Mitchell brought feedback from a roundtable of behavioral health providers. Perry, you can correct me if I'm not characterizing that correctly, who gave a bunch of feedback about what they saw as necessary in the community. The third kind of source that I think we thought about and kind of touched upon was all the work done by the behavioral health gap analysis team, the updated SIM, and that process where we looked at where are the gaps and what do we think can be addressed legislatively. So what you have before you, and Jill, I don't know if it makes the most sense for steering members to see this, but I think some of the key questions that I have for you, does this represent some of the things as a steering committee member that you think, if you had about 3 or 4 points with the legislator that you would want to bring across? Like we have a limited amount of time, got a limited amount of bandwidth. Are we hitting key points? And I think that was one of the things, Stephen, that was so important to me is we had a really concerted group who was really spirited. We had a great conversation. How representative is it? So I think in terms of the writing, I just want to give credit to Steve and Jill. Thank you for getting us together. Stephen for drafting, and there's some really good wording, I think. I've done some advocacy in the past. I think it's a pretty good product. So Jill, if it's appropriate, I know you got your hand up, but I think it would be good, and I saw a nod from Raylene to at least briefly show that. I don't think it's very long. And Jill, I'd love to hear too, I know you had your hand up, what you had to add.
Yeah, can you all see the screen that I've shared? Yeah, okay. The only thing I wanted to just clarify briefly is the meeting with Representative Rule and Joe Valentine was the October Behavioral Health Committee. So when it goes to joint meeting next week, the Legal and Justice Committee have not seen this yet. So I just wanted to clarify that. That's my only comment.
Thank you. I mischaracterized. I thought that was at our joint meeting. I think we talked about it at joint meeting, and then the actual presentation was not. Okay. Thanks, Joe, for the clarification.
Stephen.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on again to Mike's cogent comments that made this even clearer. There have been follow-up conversations on some of these, and I wanted to be clear that we were looking for obstacles that we didn't think we could address locally that probably needed a legislative or a systemic kind of fix. And we were looking at things where Representative Rule and any of our other delegation could find buy-in from other jurisdictions so that they could actually form a majority that would move some legislative action. And I think we touched on things that we hear are problems in other jurisdictions as well. It's not just Whatcom County. And lastly, I think we all ought to understand that some of these are mostly geared toward what is authorized or possible. Things right now that aren't possible, we want to make possible. But in opening up those opportunities, some of them have implications elsewhere in the system. For example, Jackie talked to Wendy Jones, for instance, about this number 3, the prescriber authority. To try to expand the ability to have more time available to prescribe psychiatric medications to inmates in the jail. But that requires a corrections officer to escort somebody to some place that we don't really have available for that. So there are all sorts of systemic limitations to this, but it's a chicken and egg kind of thing. And the legislature can't get us more correctional officers or more space to have the administration of medication, but it can allow us the opportunity to expand prescription authority or maybe even some funding for that since it's contracted out. So I just wanted to focus in. This is not a be all and an end all list, but it is an opening into some possibilities where right now we have brick walls interfering in what we'd like to be doing.
Raylene.
Here, I moved and then I couldn't find my mute button. I don't want to take too much time because I think this will be discussed more in depth at the joint meeting. But something I don't see on here, and I know I've discussed before, and Ann Deacon had some comments on it, was children. And, we are the Incarceration Prevention and Reduction Task Force, and the behavioral health needs and mental health spaces for kids in crisis isn't here. There is not facilities in Whatcom County that can help those kids. And the parents give up. The parents that can afford to will go down to Seattle. They'll go to King County. They'll get facility help there. When the kid has to call, or when the parent has to call 911, they go into the hospital, into the little unit there that is surrounded by adults that are also in crisis because there's not a separate facility. So I don't see anything on this other than, yes, we need more supervision, we need more help, but Ann said there was too much red tape and it was too expensive at the time that I asked. in reference to how can we get more facilities for that? Well, maybe we need to see if legislation can help us with the red tape, because I don't know what that all entails. I'm not a behavioral health person, but I have a niece that had to be treated down in Bellevue. At the age of 11, she had been in the hospital in Bellingham 3 times with other people for cutting, anorexia, bulimia. This shouldn't happen. I'm just giving you a personal example. I know a local attorney that had a 14-year-old that had to go down to Children's and had to deal with his child's trauma down there because there was nothing here. And he said, if I didn't have the financial means, I don't know what I would have done. And these are just 2 little tiny examples. Like I said, I could go on, and we don't have the time for that. But I think we need to look at, if we can't fix them when they're young, then they're going to be problems when they're adults. And I don't think we're focusing on that. Thank you.
Just a quick response, Raylene. The discussion of this small group and the intention, I think, of Representative Rule was, I mean, there's a need. What you just identified as a need, it's a big need. But as you said, we don't know what the red tape needs to change to. I mean, it's a research project first before you can articulate what you want a legislator to do. We wanted to come out of the box with things that we know we need, we know can be fixed, we know how they can be fixed, and we want to present that to Representative Rule to act on now. So I think that would be a place for us to do some of that research and be able to shape that into a concrete kind of recommendation. But I don't think we would be there yet, other than saying we need this thing.
I agree, Stephen, but I also know that Representative Rule does treat children on a personal basis. So she may give us a little more direction on that, also as a research base and not just as a legislative piece.
And as I indicated, there is a background list, a bigger list, and if I'm not mistaken, that something like that might be on this, and we can shape that more because we want to give her a bigger picture in case those topics come up in discussion with other legislators, and she can jump on board because she knows we'll support those as well. We had a hard time really refining this down to a discrete number of doable things. And this is what we ended up with, but.
Thank you very much. Excellent.
Arlene.
There are 2 topics that you've been talking about that would be addressed if we had, if we would consider a 24/7 urgent care system, and that would be rather larger than just an urgent care. That would also have security facilities and treatment for children and elderly, all the whole range. This would address the 2 gaps that we're talking about, children and the limitations of who can go to a crisis stabilization, because it would take almost everything. And that would be a delivery treatment system. So I know we can't address that right this minute because we're doing what we can do at the moment, but please keep in mind that that is one of the possible answers to what we need. And is that a big project? Yes, it is a very big project. Is it needed in the Northwest? It is needed in the Northwest. 5 counties are up this way, and they're all needing this. So just file it, please.
Yeah, we've dropped that question before. The Swiss group, that's the new, Snohomish, Whatcom Island, Skagit, and San Juan County legislative group. And we've talked about both competency restoration and a 24/7 kind of thing that you're talking about, Arlene. Stephen?
Barry, one of the other questions we weren't sure that we didn't have unanimity on because we weren't sure of the status is number 4, looking for statutory authority and ongoing funding for local competency evaluation and restoration services. We didn't want to step on the toes of yours and Perry's work group. So I don't know if this framing of the request is consistent with the direction you all are talking about, or whether it interferes with that. We didn't want to interfere with it, but we did want to put it on the short list of things for a representative rule.
It looks fine to me, but I'll let Perry, if he's got any concerns, he would have more insight.
No, thank you. And I think it's general enough because
Yeah.
this work group, is really gathering information and considering, a variety of different options, anything that we can do in more of an immediate time frame, as well as looking at longer range, possible answers to the challenges that go on. So I think the way that it's worded, I would certainly interpret that to be support resources, funding, in regard to that. And of course, it's not unique to Whatcom County. It is true across the state for all 39 counties in the.
And Stephen, it's being kind of presented that way, like to Wasac. Wasac's presenting it that way. So I think it's a consistent message.
Okay, good, because we were just clear, it's not, we can't wait for DSHS and Western State to stop paying tens of thousands of dollars of fines and instead comply with the court order, and we can't wait for the King County prosecutor's litigation to resolve itself. So we wanted to focus on allowing local action on that.
Yeah. All right. Thanks. Anything else on legislative priorities? Okay.
Does anybody have any objection with our presenting these to the joint committee and seeking endorsements so that we can put them in front of Representative Rule?
Jack's got his hand
My
up.
hand's not up for the objection. My hand's up to say thank you. I think it's
Yeah.
great. I really appreciate too the flexibility of a little more local stuff. That's something that always comes up, that the policies in Yakima don't always match Whatcom, don't always match, Tri-Cities. So I think having wise flexibility where appropriate. I get tired of siloed funds that can't be used because of some policy when we know locally they could be used better. So anything you can do is great. Thanks for your efforts.
Yeah, I would say go ahead, present that, and give us feedback as you get it. All right, let's move on to the 2023 draft meeting calendar. Jill?
Just wanted to let you guys know that the draft calendar is available. It's going to the full task force for approval for next year's meetings. If you have any questions or concerns, please let me know. And I can share screen if you'd like. Otherwise, it's on the second page after your agenda for today.
I think that'll do. We're about out of time and I do have to leave right at 12:30. So what
Hey,
about,
Barry,
yeah, Jack,
do we do anything about the agenda for the next meeting?
that's where I'm getting to. That's next.
Okay, I was just thinking it's for,
Yeah, we had one more thing. And that is the agenda
yeah,
for the
our
next meeting.
primary purpose. Yeah, all right.
Yeah.
I will say that
Exactly.
the agenda for the next meeting is locked. It's a big meeting. It's got the SAC draft report for IPRTF review and endorsement. It's also got the 2022 year-end report. And then, of course, the 2023 calendar. So I was instructed to lock this agenda. If there's anything else you'd like to add, keep those big items in mind.
Does anybody have anything they want to put on?
Well,
Calendar.
ideally, we would run by the legislative priorities and report on the discussion with Representative Rule and Senator Schumate.
Well, let's do it if we have time, Stephen.
I can add that just as a teaser for sure.
Okay.
Okay. All right, and under other business, I just had one other thing, and that is to announce, and maybe Jill can give us the details. We're working on a renaming and a kind of a branding ceremony for the Ann Deacon Center for Hope in January. And I think the date and now is January 5th. Is that correct, Jill?
That's correct, January 5th at 10 a.m. the executive's office is working on putting together an event to do that, and we're working with Pyramid to get the word out to the community about that in the task force effort. We're working on the communications plan and that postering that was discussed earlier for the SAC committee. I haven't dropped this on Dana yet, Barry, but I imagine a similar effort will need to be done for Pyramid Communications and the IPRTF staff.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's been a great use of our communications folk that we brought on. They were excited to hear that we could do an event like this because they really had seized on the Crisis Stabilization Center as a key kind of a rollout to the community in the communications about the work of the task force. So that's going to be good that gets highlighted out in ceremony. Anybody else have any other business?
I'm just wondering if Perry can stay on for a couple minutes with Jill. I sent you an email, Perry. I think I might have got that thing solved. We just get that put to bed.
I'll stick around.
Great.
Is there anybody from the public that would like to speak, Jill?
We have 2 virtual attendees today. Either of you would like to speak to the committee, please virtually raise your hand now. And no hands are raised. And Stephen, if you could stay after as well, that would be great.
Okay, folks.
Bye.
Thanks
Bye,
for all your
Caleb.
hard work, and we will see you on the 19th. We're
Bye,
adjourned.
everyone.